Welcome. We okay to start? So I'm Mark McDonald. This is going to be a different session to the other ones. The other sessions are sort of talks. This is a bit more of a informal discussion that we're going to have. We've got a few people. Michael Grove is here. He's going to try and lead the discussion, and everyone here, I'm glad that you've joined us. Cesare, remember he gave a talk a few days ago. He'll also be helping to lead these discussions. So thanks. I think instead of the previous convention, which was to use the matrix chat, what we're going to do is just use the regular Zoom chat if anyone has anything to say, but actually preferably you turn your mic on and use your voice. I think that would be the most natural way forward if you're comfortable doing so. Okay, so maybe I'll just say a little bit more. So I'm Mark McDonald. I'm Lancaster University and the director of teaching there. My interest in AI is because I have some responsibility for the curriculum, and in March we started to realize that this is potentially a problem. So this is my interest in the subject. Yeah, Michael, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and I think thanks for the invitation to you, Christian, Chris, all other organisers to be involved. I'm Michael Grove. My current role is I'm Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education Policy and Standards at the University of Birmingham. And like Mark, I kind of came upon generative AI possibly a month earlier, around February. But now have sort of institutional responsibility for overseeing this. But my background is as a professor of mathematics here. So very much we're working as an institution to see how we kind of not only sort of mitigate some of the challenges around our assessments, but embrace some of the opportunities that might come from this. So I think this is a great opportunity to have a broader discussion.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and Cesare, did you want to just say a little bit about your involvement?
Hi. Cesare Detail. I'm a lecturer in mathematics at the University of Manchester. So my interest in generative AI is actually from a lot of years ago, but mainly as a hobby, just to look at what it does. So now that my hobby became a huge problem, I'm happy to lend a hand and whatnot. I don't have institutional responsibility at the moment in my role, but I'm in a few committees and we're discussing what to do, what to reform in policy and similar things.
Great, thanks a lot. Right, yeah, so how should we start? Michael, do you want to give a little introduction?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and kind of keep it quite brief, but I suspect, like many colleagues here, this sort of seemingly hit from nowhere was the perception that I had. I think there was an interesting story on the BBC a few months ago that spoke about a case at one institution where they got some data, and this is when ChatGPT first exploded on the scene, and they said that in December 2022 that no one had ever attempted to access the OpenAI site from the university campus, but 1 month later it was up to about 15,000 sort of access points in a month or so. And that really does kind of feel like the way that this has sort of exploded onto the scene. And I think for me, the first challenge was trying to unpick exactly what we meant by generative AI. And I sort of spent a bit of time with our computer scientists sort of trying to figure out what this was and what its relationship was, for example, with machine learning, and how it was different from sort of traditional machine learning algorithms, which are sort of programmed to look at make predictions based upon a given data set. Here, we're looking at systems that effectively, well, they generate new data in the form of images, text, computer code in particular. And find this with using generative AI to develop computer code is quite a frightening experience at how good it is in a variety of different programming languages. So for me, I think a big challenge was trying to unpick some of this language. What are large language models versus generative AI? And in particular, just to sort of say that the large language models are the ones that are very sort of text-based. They're trained on huge amounts of text-based data. So things like ChatGPT, they focus upon text-based outputs. And I think they're what we're really focusing our attention upon. But certainly we'll have heard about generative AI from the deep fake movement of many years previously. And I think more recent examples, there was an interesting piece that said Paul McCartney was using generative AI to pull out some of John Lennon's vocals on a previously unreleased track. So this really, I think, exploded on the scene. And I think for me, if I might just to sort of set some context of the things that it would be great to get some views and discuss here, is thinking about what the implications of generative AI are. And I think there's going to be a lot of work about what they mean in terms of society and its role in all aspects of life. But I think here we can really try and unpick this in the sense of undergraduate mathematics education. And although these sort of systems are not new, I think the first one was MIT generated in the 60s. They're becoming increasingly sophisticated, and I think that they have this potential to impact our learning, teaching, assessment, and support practices in increasingly sophisticated ways. And I think they offer the potential to sort of support academic staff in the creation and assessment of course material, and new opportunities for engaging students in problem solving, critical thinking, analysis, communication. And I think you had a session a couple of days ago on the sort of use in problem solving, I think, Mark. So
it was yesterday, I guess. Yeah.
So I think people are kind of looking at this, and I think what are the challenges we need to think about? So the implications are there, but what are some of the things we need to look at as a sector? And I think we need to think about, academic staff need to know how these tools work in the context of their disciplines. I think, we look at this from a mathematical side. Colleagues in computer science are looking at it saying, well, these systems actually write the code for the students. Colleagues in arts and humanities are thinking, well, this will effectively replace the need for a literature review. Where do we sit within mathematics? From my own perspective, a lot of my work at the moment is thinking, what are the principles that underpin their use? And I've just been involved in a piece of work with the Russell Group universities that will publish in the next couple of weeks with some staff-facing principles around how we use generative AI within teaching, learning, assessment, and support. And I also think we have to look at clear policies and procedures for misuse of these systems. Personally, I don't think our strategy can be just detect the use of generative AI and then penalize it. We have to move beyond that, but I think we do have to have clear policies, procedures for when these systems are misused. But I think most significantly, we need to help students appreciate, understand, and be able to use generative AI in terms of thinking about their own learning experience, their learning gain, but also I think significantly in terms of their graduate skills. Employers keep talking about generative AI being a graduate skill. That's perhaps a skill in itself, but what do these mean in terms of problem solving skills or the ability to communicate if these systems can do it? And I think for me, a very significant concern going into the next academic year is the vulnerability of some of our assessment methods, particularly those, I think, at the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy. So for those not familiar with Bloom, that's the kind of the recall of facts or create the perception perhaps of understanding. These generative AI systems do a really good job of that. So I think my final sort of comments, and then I'd like to just pose, if I may, a few questions we can then discuss and debate, and maybe perhaps bring Cesare in before then to say a few words, if that's okay. But for me, I think our strategy has to consist of two aspects. That's certainly what we're looking at here in Birmingham and across the Russell Group sector, is rethinking our assessment design to not only mitigate some of the effects of generative AI, but also to embrace some of the opportunities that it might have, for example, in more rapid feedback. So there are opportunities here we can use this to enhance student learning, but what are they? And they are quite different to what we do at the moment. But then also, I think the most significant one, and one to move forward very quickly, is how do we provide opportunities for students, also staff within that, to become familiar with these systems, but how do we help students become familiar with these systems and help them use them in an ethical way as part of their learning? So some institutions in the US I see are kind of setting up honor codes that sort of describe how students can use this. How do we manage that? As I say, the third strand I mentioned two, I'm going to say three, is it cannot be this detect and penalize. I've seen a couple of really high profile examples of people trying to use tools to detect where generative AI might have been used in an assessment. And these so-called false positives, I think, really come through quite strongly. Very significant case was where a member of staff took student work, fed it into GPT-4 or 3 or 4, and then said, did you create this assignment? And the system said yes, and the students were all failed on the basis of it. That's rumbling away in a sense now. So those are, I think, the three aspects of our strategy to think about. But Cesare, you've done a huge amount of kind of understanding these systems in particular. Perhaps it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So I broadly agree with the points you raised, which I'm actually happy to hear, because 6 months ago, we were not in a position where it was accepted that these systems would just be there and we would just be hit by them and we couldn't stop them or mitigate them. There's a parallel drawn with calculators in primary education somewhere. But I think one of the biggest points to acknowledge is that we are now at the beta stage or the alpha stage of generative AI, where it's now available to the public. It performs well enough for users which are not particularly educated in the sector to use it in their day-to-day work, but it's not integrated at all. Right now, GPT lives in its own browser, in its own website with its own clunky text-based interface, and the others are even worse. But what we are about to see is generative AI embedded with various degrees of effectiveness, because we haven't seen them yet, into day-to-day software. So we're going to, Snapchat already has one. We're going to see an increasing number of customer service bots using it. This morning, there was a pitch deck for a crowdfunding in a startup that I follow, and they're saying we're putting generative AI in charge of customer service, and it's going to be in Microsoft Word, in Microsoft Windows, it's going to be in Overleaf for those who use LaTeX. It's going to be in those places. So in terms of students reaching out to it, they are already using it quite a lot, but right now it's a choice. But in the future, there will just be a button there, just like they spell check or they use Grammarly, or they use any of the embedded functions in PowerPoint. You know, PowerPoint lets you auto-generate graphics, for instance. They're going to be able to use generative AI to suggest work, revise, write paragraphs, and so on. So the kind of disruption that will be there, we haven't seen it yet, because right now, yes, there is an argument where we can ask students how if we use generative AI as its own separate thing that lives outside of everything else. But we're moving towards a world where it's part of what they do. And some students, remember, students are really young in some sense, so changes impact them a lot and they perceive that as the normal, while we don't. An example I have of that is some students this year in a feedback survey told me they were confused by the traditional lecture formats I use because they couldn't pause me talking in the classroom. And that was the first time they had seen that in the university setting, which was crazy to me. But thinking about it, it's been 3 years since COVID and they were third-year undergraduates. So very soon, we're going to see students used to AI and telling them not to click the button to check whether their paragraph makes sense or whether the essay has the right pitch, to them will be alien. That's what I expect. So we should be ready for this reform, as Michael says, not only from a reactionary point of view, where we mitigate what comes at us and we try to keep doing what we're doing, even though generative AI is here. But we should actually think about what we're doing in the first place, in that we should prepare students for a world where they're going to use it, but still we have the job of preserving human critical thinking and the ability of telling what comes, whether what comes out of it is true or not, because large language models are inherently bad at the concept of truth, because the way they are built has some randomness in it. So in a nutshell, every time they put out a sentence, there is a small chance that they take the wrong path. And this is a part of how they're built. It's not a bug or something that can be ironed out, but they just try to give you the best answer that they think they want to, which does not necessarily mean the true answer or the correct answer. So especially in mathematics, where proofs are either true or not. either work or not. It's very important that our students are able to critically evaluate what comes out of the model. So that will be our main job. Maybe they'll come from an instance where the AI is just great at everything that it does, because maybe it's easier stuff. It performs better on easier stuff, or maybe just because they can't tell the difference. And now we need to tell them, you need to be critical, you need to do your own work, and you need to acquire skills that the AI has, but you need to have as well without it. So what are these skills? Maybe essay writing is not particularly fundamental in what comes, but the ability to come up with a proof or to explain something, or many others will be. So singling out the skills and motivating them both through honor codes, but also through assessment, but through authentic assessment authenticity, where they are assessed on the things that we want them to learn. And so we need to create the conditions for them to do it, which might be an in-person exam or might be something else, will be crucial. So yeah, in a way, prepare for further disruption. I think this was a slide in my January talk, but it's true.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I just wanted to, I really like the analogy with spell check, because the thing is with spell check, we essentially assume that people are using spell check and we accept it. But one of the learning outcomes of our modules is not being able to spell words. Like, that's not one of the goals of our degree programs. Whereas critical thinking and being able to analyze things, that is one of the goals. And if AI will be able to do that, then we're in trouble. You know, it would be, the analogy would be like if we were assessing a student on being able to spell things, but we shouldn't let them use a spell checker, I guess, right? So either we stop letting them use it, or we change what the goals of the module are. It seems like those are the only two options. So, and it's not clear which direction we're going to go in here. So I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that one.
And there are real similarities there, Mark, aren't there, with the use of the rise of the calculator for those, you know, that we had this debate when should students be able to use calculators, and I think you've really highlighted it there incredibly nicely, that it's about rethinking that assessment design, and I think that's what underpins this is asking, what are we assessing? Because, you know, remember that, you know, all of these systems use they're based upon kind of user generated validation or content, so the human has a role in this process very much at the moment, but these systems assemble it, so we will still need students who can kind of validate that knowledge and create it, but perhaps that factual recall that we've often relied upon, we move away from that. So is it perhaps a good time, and I think, you know, flagging your questions, Mark. So these you sort of nailed these questions, I think, really quite nicely. So these are ones that Mark proposed, and I think they're really incredibly timely, which is to ask short term and long term, which I think exactly is what Cesare was talking about. I think reactive versus proactive. Considering perhaps short term, we'll split the part into two. But the first question is, and it'd be great to get wider views on which of our current assessment types are most vulnerable to generative AI in the mathematical sciences, and what do we do about it? And then I think related to that is, how do we start introducing staff and students to the use of generative AI and generative AI tools in an ethical way within our curriculum? And I think those are pressing things for 23, 24 that we're all going to have to grapple with. So it'd be brilliant to get some views.
I see chat. So feel free to put your hand up and turn your mic on as well. If you want to come in. Yeah, Konstantina, did you want to come in there? So maybe I'll just read the comments. Writing is an important skill because students need to communicate their ideas. Writing down a bunch of correct equations doesn't mean they solve the problem and deserve full marks. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Oh, I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
She's not muted, but
no, she's not.
We can't hear you. But I think she does touch on an important point, which is authenticity of assessment, right? Like we want to correctly evaluate whether the student has actually learned what we want them to learn. And that is a huge issue because yes, of course, a bunch of equations would not tell us, but if the AI can replicate their writing, then what? Of course, if we're thinking asynchronous assessment. Constantina, did you manage to solve them?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, I was just having the earphones and the sound was from a different place. So yes, I think I disagree a bit with Cesare about what he said about writing. Not that I don't use ChatGPTs for myself for writing, because I'm not a native English speaker. And to be honest, I found myself now, when I don't know how to write a nice English sentence, I say ChatGPT, how do I say that? And it's useful half of the time, and half of the time is rubbish. So I like, because I start from a non-empty piece of paper, you know, with some sentences, or I give ChatGPT some bullet points and it makes them in a nice paragraph. But I need to go and read the paragraph and actually realize that half of them are not exactly what I meant to say and change them. But it's nice to start from a paragraph.
Great, thanks a lot. Don, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, hi. I posted something on the chat, in the chat as well, but
Right.
it seems to me that what we really want students to do in terms of essays and even in mathematics is to be able to critique or to understand what's being said in an essay or a piece of writing, not necessarily to write it. And what ChatGPT and these other generative AI programs are doing is the writing. So do we really need students to be able to write well in order to be able to critique it? In my maths unit this semester, I've taken into some tutorial problems. I've introduced some ChatGPT output where it makes some quite glaring mistakes and asked the students to critique that. It's sort of the same level as the questions I'm asking them to work on. And they find that tremendously difficult. They can write the answer if I give them the question, but if I give them a proposed answer which has an error in it, then finding that error and correcting it is quite a different skill and one that they still have trouble with. So I'm just wondering how, you know, does this mean that we're really looking to assess something different or to teach something different?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that's actually a skill that we probably want the students to have. But I agree, I think it's underdeveloped.
But our concern is for them writing rather than critiquing. You know, the talk of banning the use of generative AI is so that the generative AI won't write their essays or give them their proofs. But is that really what we want them to have at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, this touches on another important bit where it's a bit unfair for us, for everyone to ask staff which assessment need reform and so on, because there are some things that we don't know exactly what GPT can and cannot do. But well, we've seen that it's improving. We've seen that it still has problems with some stuff, but we cannot quite predict what exactly will end up still being a problem for it, if anything. So yeah, it's a great question. For instance, GPT would be able to evaluate its own answer and tell you whether it's right or wrong, again, with varying degrees of accuracy. But again, the question is, how do we ensure that the student has, for instance, a suggestion I give was to put more weight on the oral examination that we have for projects in my department. So students have made up 1 or 2 semesters projects, and then there is, I think, a 1-hour presentation that they can give to 2 examiners. And right now it's worth just 10%. So even if I suspected that they don't really understand what's going on, I could not change a lot. But for instance, if you put more weight on there, which only changes the balance, not the workload, then we would have the ability to put more weight on the critical understanding of what the student has written. and then allow generative AI, perhaps with a report, to help them write, as long as we can later test whether they've learned.
Henrike, do you want to come in?
Sure, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
With our written exam homework, we always had the problem. We asked the students to write small proofs, and you were always able to find somewhere the same questions on the internet, because there is only a limited amount of proofs an undergrad student can do with the math he or she knows. And so the questions were already there somewhere, and it was always possible to find the same question on the internet in some forum, or I don't know, script or somewhere, when you knew how to Google. And now I put the questions into Bing or something like that. I find it a lot easier to find them, but they are there the way they were there earlier. And still, there are always some errors in the questions, and Bing will give me the best answer if it is correct, but sometimes it's not correct, and the students will have to work with it the way they used earlier. Only the looking for the question will be easier. We always have problems with definitions, that we define something different than a teacher somewhere else in Germany, and then they will get their answers wrong because the definition is different, and then ChatGPT or Bing or whatever can't really produce a reasonable proof, because using two different definitions won't work. And I think that's there they will have to learn to read the math better than they used to, but writing math will be done by AI, I guess. But reading will be much more important, and checking what is the definition I use and things like that. And we will have to ask students more to learn the definitions we use. So I guess it doesn't change too much for our students. It's just a little bit of shifting in the balance.
Thanks a lot. Michael, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And really just quick follow-up to Henrike's point there, that this isn't an unfamiliar challenge, that colleagues will, everyone here will remember when we were assessing under COVID and we had take-home exams. Does everyone remember the so-called, I won't name them, the online assessment support sites where students could sort of submit their work and somebody else would do it and then it would get handed in? I don't think this is any different to that. The difference is it's a machine that's doing it. I think it will do it much more reliably, much quicker. And I think the big change is it's potentially the sense of scale. But the challenge of actually kind of designing assessments that validate what the student knows rather than what another individual knows, I think really is key here. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this, although we focus here upon machine generated content, there is still always the challenge that will remain of what if it's another human that produces the content as well. And I think these two things have to be considered together.
Yeah, Tim, do you want to come in? Got your hand up. No, I'm not really sure. Is that a hand that Katerina has up? Yeah, okay. Katerina?
Yeah, hi. I think that Tim wanted to say something because he wrote something in the chat. Maybe he's trying
to... Yeah.
Not sure. If not, I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can go ahead. Yeah, I guess I wanted to say that I don't see that how this is different from like essay mills. And I'm concerned about two things. One is if we actually change a lot of the things that we are doing, are we still, suppose we no longer tell students how to write a proper report because we expect OpenAI to do that? Are we still giving them value for money? So that's one thing. And the other is, isn't it about time that we as mathematicians ensure that we teach our students ethics, because quite a lot of the other subjects do it, and it's not something that's enforced in a mathematics degree. And I think that we got to a point where it becomes increasingly important to do it, not just ethics about cheating or plagiarism or whatever, but also ethics to make them aware of all the biases that are being propagated with OpenAI and ensuring that that they know how to see them. Sort of the two things.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. Tim, is your Zoom working now?
Possibly, but I fear it may go again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, so one of the things that in a very sort of sad, ironic way has entertained me in sort of the university I work in over the last few months, the Open University, is that within mathematics, we have been concerned about students using software like Wolfram Alpha in remote assessments for several years. And what one way of viewing the ChatGPT thing is that really this is just providing for other subjects what Wolfram Alpha has provided for maths for several years, and it's interesting to see how they are suddenly starting to worry about things that this always awkward niche subject called mathematics has been worried about for some time.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah,
I
I did.
understand.
Sorry.
Go on. No, go on. Yeah.
No, I'd said at some point that we are a bit lucky in that, compared to other subjects, because we are used to some of our assessments being doable by software, be it calculators in this very elementary implementation, or Wolfram Alpha, or several other tools, MATLAB even, that can do this. And we rely a lot as an answer on closed book invigilated exams, which we do as a sector. I think, regardless of the push that has been done to move away from them, I think we are still at 75%. There was a report last year. So that's a strength right now that we should think about, that we know more about this than others. And so we know the difference between a student being able to produce the output that we want and a student understanding what they've done, and the difference that there is between assessing these two. So yeah, Tim's was an excellent point, that we are, as mathematicians at least, or any mathematics-based essay, easy sort of used to this paradigm of software can do it.
Yeah, and I think, for next year, we're probably safe on the exam front because we have control. And I'm of the opinion in Lancaster, for example, the sort of small courseworks are typically formative anyway. So I'm of the opinion that we don't really need to change very much, because if students are using AI systems to help them with that, they may just be hurting themselves in the exam anyway. So it's really the encouragement would be you should be learning this on your own for now, but that's, I admit, maybe a short-term view. I'm not sure about the long term. Okay, yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I was going to completely agree with you, Mark. And I actually don't think it's a short-term view. I think it's the right long-term view that we're looking at this at very much reacting to this system that's there, and it isn't dissimilar to how calculators came on the scene. That debate happened. Technologies move and change, but if we sort of think about what the role of assessment is, I think is one of the challenges that we do so much assessment, perhaps in mathematics. The focus is upon of the learning rather than for the learning. What you're advocating is using assessment to help students learn as part of that process. And if systems are used to circumvent that, then the penalty rests with the student. So for me, I think if we kind of rethink that balance, I personally think there's too much summative. I look, from my own institution sense, but I think there's too much there. But if we do what you kind of suggest and actually take that pressure off of what the marks are, and it's more than about what I learn from this and how I develop as a mathematician, and tie that to our mathematical attributes, I think that's a really key strategy. So I completely agree with you, but disagree with you that it's short term. I think that's the right long-term strategy to rethink our assessment design of why we're assessing, how we're assessing, and what the purpose of it is for.
Right. Any other comments on any of that? Yeah, Henrique.
we used written homework to help to that the students qualify for the exams. And in earlier days, that was totally on their own. If they did it or not, doesn't matter. They may write that exam. And exams were really, really bad. So we put homework on them and forced them to work during the semester, and exams got better. Now with AI, I'm not sure whether this is a good idea anymore, because if they write, if I give to our tutors the AI written homework, then no one learns anything and we just have a lot of work. So now I'm thinking if it would be better just to go back to do it or leave it. You can write your exam and it's your own fault if you don't do your homework, and you may hand it in if you want it corrected, and well, that's it. But when we did that, really our grades, they were a lot worse. So I fear that is what's going to happen next. If either way, if they don't have to hand them in, or if they hand it in by AI somehow, it will get worse with their grades. And there's no way I see how to prevent that, actually.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of institutions have been grappling with this. Is for formative work, do you give credit to it or not? And because if you do, then it changes student behavior, and if not, yeah, it's hard to get the balance. I think that's right. Ingo, do you want to come in?
Yes, so sorry if this has been discussed before, but I came late into the discussion. It's certainly true that we have to rethink assessment and what we assess and how we assess. But I'd be interested in your experience in how you can really assess the results of students' learning. And I think in the UK and US, you are a bit ahead of us because you have experience with Czech and those systems, which were only available in English. And so they didn't really play a role in Germany here. So something that we found useful is to have, for example, text questions where students have to find out the right formula, but in the end have to produce a numeric answer, since it's very hard to with an error in the theoretical foundation to get the right answer, and that's easy to detect. Some other thing that helps preventing this kind of cheating is using questions where you have some kind of graphical input, some graph that's hard to process currently yet, in particular if it's in JPEG form and not just as a JSX graph or so. So, but maybe you have some other thoughts on how we should configure assessments to assess student learning.
Yeah, I think in the long term it's a difficult one. Cesar, actually, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, there is a question in the chat from John, which is focus a lot on the negatives that AI brings to assessment. What does the panel see as benefits of using AI to assist learning? Well, so let me start with a negative here. There's been examples of people trying to use, there was actually the talk yesterday was also about that. There's other data that's when students are told to try to use GPT as a tutor, as a conversational partner, as something who can aid them learning, they're actually frustrated at its degree of how imprecise it is. And there was a quote that I liked from a student in a study which said, if I have my own misconceptions, if I have to take care of the model's misconceptions too, well then that's twice the work. So that would be a huge great application, having sort of a customer service bot that can reply to students' queries and help them learn. So if at midnight a student has a query on an equation, they can get an instant answer. The problem is, again, truth and accuracy. And there is also a factor of students in surveys. This was about marking. So we were doing a survey. There was this survey about automated marking and stuff, outsource marking, all that. And students really said that we want the feedback to be from our lecturers, because we're here to learn from them. So they valued a lot the fact that I was the one giving them feedback, which was the same person that taught them the things, or the team of lecturers, of course. And that's another important bit where it is true that students right now could learn from elsewhere, regardless of AI. They could go on YouTube and watch tutorials. Some do. But in the end, they do still choose to engage, what many do, to engage with the classroom, to engage with the lessons, because they're interested in a human contact, a human element of learning, at least for now. So assisted learning could be great in terms of what I call admin work. Admin work might be transcribing, note-taking, translation for those who need it. Accessibility tools would get a lot better. We're already getting a lot better. For example, Whisper from OpenAI is a voice-to-text API, and it's much better than the Google keyboard or the voice-to-text of phones, because it puts generative AI on top of that to understand, quote marks, what you're saying. And so it's much less likely to put typos or to understand a word instead of another, because it puts it in context. So that's the first big application that will be there without our input in a way. And then, of course, having AI give students feedback on tone, or having our own little chatbots that we prompted and trained. This is years ahead. We don't have the skills to do that. But we might in the future be able to sort of train a chatbot to answer as we would, and making sure that it knows the content that we're assessing in the course, and then seeing what happens sort of as an autoresponder. But one thing we can certainly do, for instance, soon will be put it in our emails, and then it can draft emails to answer queries, and then we become much faster at that, which has a direct benefit to students, especially given the higher workload in the sector. So assisting learning more as a secretarial role, more as in a secretarial role than in as a teacher role, because I don't think it's quite ready for that. And I doubt it ever will be.
Well, Ingo, did you want to come back in?
Yeah. Well, my question was not doubting that AI tools can be useful for learning and can be helpful. They will develop further, but it was restricted to assessment. So how can we react to that? And I think we shouldn't focus too much on the current state of AI. The time frame where we can use AI generated solutions as a bad example may be very short, and it's closing quickly. It has been moved in the last months from the end of K-12 to the early university level, and it's going to go up further. So imagine that an AI that is almost perfect in what it does currently. So how can we react then? We shouldn't have a too short perspective here.
Yeah, and I think, well, I think probably a lot of us are relieved that we do have, as Cesare mentioned, a lot of in-person exams. So that's ultimately a way of preserving integrity. But yeah, I think there's some big questions about what should we be asking students in those exams? Should that change? Should we keep it the same? It comes into questions about employability that I think we don't know. You know, what skills are the students going to need afterwards? I don't know. These are big questions that, yeah, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I mean, just picking up on Ingo's point there. I mean, we've often long debated what the purpose of the exam was anyway. Do you remember when we went pandemic and there was a lot of debate about some institutions not going back to on-campus exams? Now the discussion is, do we go back to more on-campus exams because of this generative AI effect? I mean, I want to sort of pick on your point, Mark, around the graduate attribute side, because I think there is thinking about what does it mean to be a professional mathematician. That I think we are a discipline that puts graduates into so many different fields, which I think is a real strength. I think that then brings some challenges around how do we prepare students for those different fields. But we also have to remember we want to train research mathematicians as well. That's part of what we do, and thinking a little bit about that. But I think going back to Don's point that quite rightly challenges on what are the opportunities here. And certainly I've kind of done a lot of work around mathematics support, where it's that interaction between an individual and a tutor and that dialogue. And often, we can train these systems with the questions that we ask, but these systems won't always know what are the right questions to ask back in order to do the thinking. So they can kind of prompt with information, but can they necessarily prompt with questions in the right way that a human can, based upon our experience as mathematicians? So for me, I think that learning from misconceptions, Martin Greenhow did a lot of this many years ago around his Maths EG, where he had diagnostic tests. Chris Sanguin's done it with the feedback. Numbers does this as well, where the feedback is the key. So students were deliberately making mistakes so they could learn from that feedback. So can we actually use this generative AI in terms of exploring those misconceptions? And I think we're also focusing upon learning as being a one-to-one relationship between an individual and a tutor, or an individual and a machine. And I think there's an interesting role that, why do we as mathematicians go to academic conferences? We go there to be part of those discussions with lots of other mathematicians. And I think maybe there's another way of kind of rethinking the social aspect of learning that really is quite important. And don't know about other colleagues here, but that was the bit that hit our students most in the pandemic, that not being able to sort of test and challenge things, have the conversation, see what different people know, unpick those misconceptions. I agree with Cesare, students don't like the idea of dealing with misconceptions of others, but actually misconceptions are a great way of developing our learning.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, taking a longer term view, what are humans going to need to do in the future if AI takes over everything? I think there ultimately will still be that human interaction, dialogue, communication. Like, those are the skills that, no matter what happens, are surely going to be important. So I think are still worth developing.
And the emotion, I think, Mark, as well, that again, we know in math support that the friendly, positive, outgoing tutor is really quite key to building that learning environment, and how, effectively what you can have here is kind of a cold machine in many ways, sort of firing back lots of information, but actually not necessarily helping you assimilate that and understanding you as an individual. And I think that's the kind of key side that, for me, a learning experience, I think it was MIT that said this when they produced their open courseware. They produce all the lectures and materials, made them online, and people said, well, aren't you worried no one's ever going to come to MIT anymore? And they said, well, if you think an MIT degree is just a set of materials, it isn't. It's the experience, it's the interaction, it's the campus environment, it's those learning opportunities. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we know students really benefit from staff who take an interest in them, support them, care about them, friendly or outgoing. I don't think the machines are set up to do that at the moment. So that human side, I think, will always come through, as you suggest.
Yeah, I guess one of the practical questions is how do we ensure that happens? I think one of the things that I try and push for is, say, group work, for example. I think group work is quite a good, there's a lot of broad benefits to group work, including perhaps better mathematical understanding, because it allows that sort of dialogue between students. But yeah, how do we get these changes to happen? I think that's maybe a bigger question as well. Well, Michael, you're on an institutional, leading an institutional thing, so.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I knew that was coming in my direction. You're completely right, but I think we embrace this as an opportunity that generative AI, I think, will give us the vehicle to make the changes to our assessment and teaching methods that we've probably, to be fair, needed to do for years, Mark. I couldn't agree with you more about group work. I sort of teach it in year one here. We have it in year two. And it's another way of mitigating this, because the group can then also help moderate some of the activities that happen. So for me, I think institutions are, again, I don't want to lose Don's point about what the opportunities are, but I think the fact that everybody across the world is worried about the implications of generative AI, I think that will be an opportunity to turn around and say, actually, group work is a way that can mitigate this. It also brings some extra, it brings a huge number of benefits as well. So, we're focusing upon just mitigating the generative AI, but actually the changes we make will make for better mathematicians with the skills that we expect mathematicians to have. And certainly I think the group work, another real benefit of it is it makes students part of a community, the support group, the friendships, that are all a key part of that learning experience. So our sort of approach here is very much going to be supporting colleagues to make changes. One thing that we've done here that I think is a really big step is something around synoptic assessment. So previously assessment has always had, this one-to-one mapping between a module and an assessment and a mark that goes into a system. Here we're redesigning our framework so that you can have assessments that span multiple modules, so that you can kind of combine learning from across different modules, or thinking about how the credit structures are. So I think institutions are changing. I think that pace of change can always take time, because we just look from the perspective of mathematics. I'm now realizing that there are 23 other schools here that have very, very valid perspectives. But I think we can use the discussion around generative AI to bring in some changes, as you suggest.
Ingo, you want to come in?
Yeah, well, I like very much Marcus' point on using generative AI as part of the assessment. I think that's something, some interesting idea, in particular for, as he calls it, synoptic assessment. So what about, for example, such a kind of exam? We give a somehow realistic, not very precisely defined problem to a student, and we tell them, well, here is ChatGPT, you can use it. Show me the questions that you asked to ChatGPT, and I'll evaluate how efficient you are in asking questions. Usually asking the right questions is a high demand, so that may not be for beginner students. But for advanced students, it may demonstrate some kind of understanding that we couldn't see when we just consider their answers, which they may take from ChatGPT. Just an idea to be tried out.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Like it's especially for things like projects. How are we going to get students to reference essentially that they have used it? I mean, it's good academic practice to acknowledge sources of help. And where is the line? They don't reference that they've used a grammar checker. When will we expect them to reference things like ChatGPT? I think that's an open question.
Also about prompts, there is right now prompt engineering is quite valued because GPT is not great yet. It's absolutely amazing, and of course, but it's not at a human level of understanding. So yeah, it has to be told context. Also, we're not amazing communicators, but GPT is trained to be a natural conversation partner, right? So it's sort of as reinforcement learning flattened on a helpful secretarial chatbot. So in a way, the best way to get results out of GPT would be to just talk to it. Like, hi, GPT, please, I need to do this. Can you help me do it? Here's what I want to do. The prompts there are like, pretend you are Albert Einstein and use whatever to do that. Can sometimes yield better results. But in the long run, I expect the first GPT becomes better in natural conversation, because that's kind of why it's so popular, right? Because you don't need to be an expert in prompt engineering to write some fancy GPT code. You just talk to it. And it will become better at talking to it, and probably won't even like prompt engineering when it's too extreme, because it will look weird and awkward in the context of the conversation. If I wanted Michael to help me write something, I wouldn't go to Michael and say, hi, Michael, pretend you are Terence Tao and you are a super intelligent version of it in the year 3000. I need you to write. No, I wouldn't do that. And if I did, Michael would look at me weird and probably give me not as great as an output as if I just asked him, please, can you help me do this? I want to do that. So that's kind of the thing. I think prompt engineering is a very short-term skill, which is just a byproduct of how language models are currently implemented. But when they are in Word, in Microsoft Word, they can read what you're writing and you can ask, can you suggest this? I think natural language will be enough, to be honest. Happy to be proved wrong, but unless you're trying to hack the model to make it do stuff it's not supposed to do, for day-to-day use, I'm very skeptical about prompts being relevant a year from now.
Cesare, Michael would just be incredibly grateful to be mentioned in the same sentence as Terence Toe. So thank you.
But yeah, I think, I mean, this is maybe even a somewhat short-term issue in the sense of referencing, because yeah, like asking students to submit their prompts, if we are encouraging to use AI, yeah, how, it doesn't seem like a long-term solution. Is it a valid thing to do short-term? It's hard to evaluate. It does ultimately still seem like malpractice to significantly use ChatGPT output as and claim it as your own, but beyond that, it's maybe a gray area. Conscious of time, we're almost done here, but maybe just have one more comment from Ingo and then Michael to conclude.
Yes, we know that it's how difficult it is to ask good mathematical questions. And a question that you ask to ChatGPT is not just the formulation of a prompt with giving context on, it also contains the mathematical context and content that's asked. And that I think we can assess. Okay, so much.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, Mark, and I think it was just to follow up, really, my initial hand up was to follow that point about, you know, we've got to make sure that we cannot just have the system where, you know, students are using this and kind of uploading the work as their own and passing it off. I think will tools improve around how we detect this? Potentially, but we as institutions have to make sure that we've got the proper policies in place. But if you want me to kind of wrap up, I think this has been a really quite interesting discussion. I think it shows very much where we are at the moment in terms of thinking across the sector, that what we're worried about is the academic integrity side and how we mitigate that. And I think that's entirely understandable. You know, we're just through one academic year. We've probably got away with this because it came so late in the cycle, we didn't have to think about it, but that's not going to be the same for next year. So our thoughts are, what do we do over the summer for 23-24? So I think where we are and how we're thinking is entirely understandable. I think institutions are going to be working on this as a whole. And I think I wouldn't want to lose sight of what we can learn from other disciplines as well. I think, you know, just having those dialogues about some of the challenges that they face and the opportunities, I think can let us sort of think of creative ways of doing this. But I think it's also thinking about now, the point I say that Don's made about what are the opportunities. And I think dealing with generative AI is part of a bigger piece of work around assessment and feedback. And there are sort of assessment tools and platforms that state they can help us with that. We should do some work looking at those. But really, let's think about what we do to embrace this and use it as part of the student experience. Let's focus upon how we educate staff and students around ethical use. And then hopefully that means we only have to concentrate on a very small number of cases of collusion, academic malpractice, which I think we already see anyway. You know, that there are opportunities for students to collude and cheat if they want to, but many of them don't choose to do that. We shouldn't just assume that because these systems are there, every student is going to move in that direction. But I think reiterating the point you made, Mark, about thinking of assessment as for learning rather than of learning, and reframing that narrative so that we spend more time on high quality assessment that helps learning rather than is about awarding marks for summative purposes.
Thanks a lot. Okay, cool. So I've just tried to share my screen for this afternoon's talk. So there's a talk this afternoon, numbers trading. Christian's going to lead starting at 3:30. So that's it. Thanks everyone for joining for a lively discussion. It's been great, and I will see you at another one.